My name is John Kierkegaard. I'm a Chief Research Scientist at CSIRO Agriculture and Food in Canberra. I lead a GRDC-funded project on improving the efficiency of farming systems in southern New South Wales. I lead the project along with other colleagues at CSIRO, colleagues at New South Wales DPI, based in Wagga and Condobolin, and a number of local advisors who work with us to ensure that the work is relevant to local farmer needs. The overall goal of the project is closing the gap in the efficiency of our farming systems. In other words, the dollars we make per millimetre of rainfall that we receive. Earlier research indicated that we are not achieving the potential across the sequence. We've done a lot of work previously on individual crops, the efficiency of individual crops and how well they use water. But in a dryland farming system, we know that water, nitrogen, weeds, diseases, all of these factors that affect profitability and productivity carry over from year to year. And so it's actually the efficiency of how we use rainfall across an entire sequence that ultimately is of interest to advisors and growers. So we have 4 sites in this project. I'm here at our high rainfall site at Greenthorpe. We have a large core site at Wagga Wagga, a lower rainfall site at Condobolin, and a site further south on a heavier clay soil at Urannah. So we established this series of experimental sites in 2017 when we consulted widely with growers and advisors in the local area to understand what they were currently doing and what ideas they had for ways to improve their profitability over a whole crop sequence. On the basis of that information, we set up treatments at all of our 4 sites. We have a core set of treatments across all 4 sites so that we can compare different systems across the sites. And then at each site, the different advisors and farmers in those areas also added on some specific treatments that were relevant to that site that they were interested to see in their local area. So across all the sites, the consistent baseline system that farmers said they were currently operating was essentially a canola wheat sequence or a canola wheat barley sequence. Generally with crops sown in May, and currently the average nitrogen fertiliser strategy of most growers is relatively conservative. So we made that our baseline system. May sown crops in a canola wheat barley or canola wheat sequence, and with a reasonably conservative nitrogen strategy. And by conservative, I'm talking about a strategy that assumes that the rainfall in the season is probably going to be below average, say a decile 2 or 3, and nitrogen would be top dressed accordingly. So those were the systems that we set up at each of the sites, and we wanted to look at the effect of 3 different types of management levers at those sites. So the first lever was the idea of sowing crops earlier. In this area in southern New South Wales, sowing crops early and particularly grazing them is a reasonably widespread practice. Many farmers are sowing crops early and grazing them. That allows growers to make some money from the grazing prior to locking them up and receiving grain. So it's a way that you can improve your profit for the amount of rainfall you're given. So that seemed like a really good option and a management lever we could try. And we included grazing canola and grazing cereals in those treatments. We also had treatments that we sowed early but did not graze. GRDC investments recently have demonstrated that with the right slow maturing wheat or canola varieties, sowing early can give you higher yield potential and better water use efficiency, particularly in good seasons. So the second element we wanted to investigate was the effect of increasing the diversity of crops that we grow in our system. So we wanted to introduce different legumes into the canola wheat or canola wheat barley baseline system. And growers and advisors wanted to see a range of different types of legume options, and they included the higher risk human food grain pulses like chickpeas and lentils, The more traditional crops like faba bean and lupins, which already exist in small areas in southern New South Wales, and also crops like vetch, which have multi-purpose on mixed farms. They can be grazed, they can be cut for hay, or in some cases they can be brown manured. So at all of our sites, we introduced representatives of those legumes into the canola wheat baseline to see if we could indeed grow these crops profitably and capture benefits from them across the entire sequence. We know the area of grain legumes is quite low in southern New South Wales. There are various reasons for that, but we suspect when their value is calculated and their impact calculated across a number of years to pick up the legacy effects of increased nitrogen, we may find them performing much better than most people consider. So increasing crop diversity was the second management strategy. The third factor we wanted to manipulate was the nitrogen fertiliser strategy, partly to compare using legumes to provide nitrogen with just increasing our nitrogen fertiliser strategy, but also looking at two different strategies of nitrogen supply. One, the more conservative strategy, where we maintain nitrogen levels reasonably low, assuming seasons are probably going to finish below average, and compare that with a more robust strategy where we keep the nitrogen supply reasonably high. We assume the season is going to finish well, and if it doesn't, that the nitrogen will carry over to subsequent crops, maintain our soil organic matter, and make sure we capitalise on those very wet years when they arrive. So those three factors, early sowing, with and without grazing, more crop diversity, and different nitrogen strategies, were all included at the sites. And one of the unique features, I think, of this project is that we are looking at the interaction of all of those factors. Farmers are managing all of those factors all of the time, and this project gave us an opportunity to look at how they interact and how the profitability compares over a number of years. So the experiments were set up in 3-year phases. We're currently in the second year of our second phase. So the first phase ran from 2018 through to 2020, and we're able to analyse the data arising from the experiment every 3 years, fully analyse it because of the 3-year phase design. At the end of 6 years, we'll have a second phase, and of course, the more phases we get, the more seasonal conditions we encounter, the more robust, and relevant the advice to growers will be. As you may recall, 2018 and 19, the 2 first years of the experiments were very dry, 2 decile 1 to 2 years in a row. So the sorts of responses we were getting, the kind of profitability we were seeing in different systems really was reflected by that very, very sequence of dry seasons. And since then, 2020 through to this year, 2022, we've had the opposite. We've had very wet seasons, so decile 8 and 9 seasons. So we've encountered quite a range of seasons, if not a little extreme at either end, but it has allowed us to see how robust these different systems, these different combinations of systems have held up, the different issues that emerge, but how they play out over a period of time. After the first phase of the project at the end of 2020, we were able to analyse the profitability of all those different systems and treatments. And there's been a few consistent findings across the sites. So the first thing is that the most profitable systems that emerged were the early sown grazed systems, which turned out to be profitable in both the very dry years, but also in the wetter year of 2020. And that's because by grazing the crops in winter, we always make some money. And if things subsequently turn dry, as they did in 2018 and 19, where some of the grain crops either had to be cut for hay or didn't produce much grain at all, obviously the profit of those crops is going to be lower. than where we've been able to make money from the grazing and then possibly get either a hay cut or grain as well. In the wet years, of course, you get the grazing and then the crops have grown on to produce a good grain yield as well, where you manage that grazing and the timing of that grazing well. So early sown grazed crops were profitable, and they were very responsive to the nitrogen. So those grazing systems where there's a high requirement for nitrogen, not only to produce forage, but also then to go on and produce grain, were very responsive to the higher nitrogen strategy. So that was the first observation, which happened at both Wagga and at Greenthorpe. The profitability of the grazing crops was much higher at Greenthorpe, where we have more rainfall, earlier sowing opportunities, so a greater opportunity to capture that forage and grain yield benefit of dual-purpose crops. The second finding for the crops which were not grazed, so these are the grain-only crops now, the most profitable systems in the grain-only options were always systems that involved a legume, so the more diverse systems, and with low nitrogen supply. So in other words, those systems were profitable because the legume didn't require any fertiliser nitrogen. It saved some nitrogen or fixed some nitrogen for the subsequent crops, on average about 50 kilograms per hectare. And the wheat and the canola in rotation with the legumes also yielded slightly higher. So we're saving money on particularly nitrogen inputs. We're still maintaining high canola and wheat yields. And at all of the sites, there was a legume that in its own right was profitable, maybe not always as profitable as the best canola or wheat, but competitive. And so when you added all that up, we always had a reasonably profitable option that included a legume. Our canola wheat baseline systems were also reasonably profitable. The things that were the least profitable at all the sites were early sown crops which we did not graze. This was really driven by the fact that in the droughts, those early sown crops, if you're not going to graze them, will often use a lot of water, and then when you get into the dry spring, they crash and hay off, and you lose money on those. So sowing those early crops in March and not grazing them was a really unprofitable option. And the other options that tended to not be very profitable were the continuous wheat options with low nitrogen. They tended to suffer a lot from disease issues, and their yield levels were never quite as high as where we had a nice diverse system with canola, wheat and legume together. The good news is that at all 4 sites, we found options that were $200 to $300 per hectare per year more profitable than our baseline systems of canola, wheat, barley, sown in May, and with a conservative nitrogen strategy. So what that tells us is that within our farming system, there are opportunities to tweak some of those different management levers and to capture some interactions between them to really drive up the profitability of our whole crop sequence over a 3-year period.